As John said, my name is Melissa Work. I am only 31 years old, and I live in the Pasco County area. I'm a wife to my amazing husband, Gene, and I'm also a mommy to our two beautiful miracle babies, Blake and Bella. You're probably wondering, who is this woman? Why is she here, and what happened to her hair? But I promise we'll get to all of that. Like John said, just 5 short months ago, on September 6th, I was laying in a hospital bed over at Moffitt Cancer Center on the bone marrow transplant floor. I had just finished receiving 5 days straight of some of the harshest chemotherapy treatments. My sister was on the other side of the hospital in an operating room, literally giving up herself for me. I was just hours away from receiving my long-awaited, life-saving, but life-risking bone marrow transplant. That morning, our dear friend and pastor, John Ferris, came to pray with us. He had some encouraging words for me and then told me that God had put something very special on his heart. So on the actual day of my transplant, just 5 short months ago, he, along with Mr. Christian Brown, asked me to speak today. And all I had to do to get here was to get through this transplant. I then agreed with a huge smile on my face. Little did I know I would soon be in the fight of my life while enduring the hardest days of my life. I honestly had a pretty normal, healthy childhood living in Northwest Indiana. I'm the middle child of 5. I have 3 other sisters and 1 brother. We were raised Christian in both the school and the church we attended. So when I was younger, I knew that I asked Jesus into my heart and I was on my way to heaven, so that was good enough for me. I was young and felt that I didn't really have to rely on him for anything. Needless to say, that all changed later on in life. Because my parents worked a lot and were gone for most of the day, my oldest sister, Becca, would take on that motherly role. She was someone that I always admired and looked up to. I wanted to be like her so much that I would sneak into her room and steal her clothes and her makeup. Sorry, Luke. When she moved out, I stole her room and also her first car. I had no idea that someday I would be taking her bone marrow too. My senior year of school was the year I felt like my life was starting to fall apart. I was bullied relentlessly. My parents were getting a divorce on top of that, and I just felt like there weren't any more reasons to live. One day it drove me to putting my parents' gun to my head and wanting to end my life. I froze, put the gun down, and reached out to my principal for help. He ended up buying me a one-way ticket to Florida. Just weeks before I was to graduate, I dropped out and moved away from anything I ever knew. My principal saved my life that day. 2007, the year I moved down here, I would one day discover my stomach covered in bruises. I would spend the next few years going for my first opinion doctor, who tried failed treatments on me, then declaring I was fine, to a second opinion doctor who suspected leukemia and gave me my first bone marrow biopsy right there on the doctor table. While wide awake, he would then literally hammer into my hip bone with only lidocaine given and would retrieve my marrow in hopes of finding an answer. During this time, I had gotten into a very toxic relationship. I was young, vulnerable, wanted attention from anyone, and was just trying to find my place in the world. Before I knew it, we were living together. About 4 or 5 months into our relationship, it began to slowly turn abusive. It started out with verbal abuse about my looks, emotional abuse reminding me that nobody else would want me, and then it escalated to physical abuse as he publicly slapped me for the first time inside of a country bar during an Eric Church concert. There were many drunk nights that he would physically abuse me, from throwing glasses full of rum at my head, throwing hot cigarettes on me, to dragging me down the hall by my hair and then my legs when I was at my weakest following a treatment. A year and a half later, through a series of events, God finally forced me away from this toxic relationship. In 2009, me and my friends had decided to go out to a sports bar before we went out for the evening. In fact, it was a Steelers sports bar. That night, we played darts with 2 strangers. One of the guys would hardly look at me. He was extremely shy, so kind and ridiculously handsome. That night, although he is a humongous Cleveland Browns fan, I met my future husband in a Pittsburgh Steelers sports bar. We immediately fell in love, so much so that we became pregnant with our son Blake just months after being together. We were so excited. I was considered a super high-risk pregnancy and delivery with our son, but by the grace of God, our sweet Blake was safely delivered, and I was now a mommy. My son was around 6 months old when my second opinion doctor referred me to Moffitt Cancer Center in hopes of helping figure me out. I had no idea that my new doctor, Dr. Alan List, was also the CEO of Moffitt and someone who would save my life. I love that man so much. After receiving my third bone marrow biopsy, I was officially diagnosed with a super rare type of bone marrow failure disease called aplastic anemia. The name for it is actually omega-karyocytic thrombocytopenia purpura. Try saying that 3 times fast. It just means that my bone marrow is dying and no longer produced most of my blood products. The main thing affected was my absence of platelets. It is rare, very life-threatening, and the only cure is a bone marrow transplant. I would spend the next 2 years or so in and out of Moffitt for blood work, a few more failed treatments, and many transfusions. My doctor wasn't ready for me to risk my life through transplant just yet. I'm forever grateful to him for not rushing that, because we would not have had our daughter if I would have had it done any earlier. In 2012, the lymph nodes in my neck grew to gigantic sizes, and the best way I can describe it is looking like the Incredible Hulk. A PET scan was ordered for me immediately. I'll never forget my doctor calling me just a few days later. I was told that my abdomen also had swollen lymph nodes and everything was showing up white hot on the scan. He explained that white hot on those results meant cancer. He then regretfully told me that I had lymphoma and that they would be scheduling chemo treatments for me ASAP. I was also going to receive a lymph node biopsy to stage the cancer. Following the biopsy, they told me that the lymph nodes they took out did not have any cancer cells in them, but they just didn't believe that result. They said physically looking at the lymph nodes after removing them looked just like cancer. They explained that I would need another biopsy just to make sure. I received a call and will never forget it. They explained that they had no idea how, but they again could not find any cancer cells. They had even sent off my biopsies to the National Institute of Health just to be sure. They couldn't find cancer, and it was a miracle, they called it. So that left me with one other diagnosis, another extremely rare disease called Kikuchi-Fujimoto disease that is normally only found in Asia and Japan. Just my luck. I was treated with steroids and my lymph nodes decreased in size. So now I had 2 rare diseases under my belt. 2014, we became pregnant with our daughter Bella. Our happiness quickly turned to fear once the reality of how bad my bone marrow failure disease had gotten. Bella was taking the little bit of blood I had left, so that left me with none. I received around 12 blood and platelet transfusions with her. I acquired an antibody from the many transfusions, and it became an even greater risk to us. There was even talk of having to put a needle through my stomach, paralyzing her and giving her a blood transfusion through my belly. I remember begging God to please let me keep her. I would do anything, just please don't let us die. My doctor then decided to try something new and risky to hopefully keep me from getting transfusions and passing the antibody on to her. So we tried a new bone marrow shot. I had only been the 3rd pregnant woman ever to receive it, and it was successful. I received the shot the rest of my pregnancy, on top of having 3 high-risk appointments a week, just to keep an eye on her, but we made it. I had another beautiful, all-natural delivery, and she was perfect and healthy. I now had another reason to keep fighting. I went back to my labs being monitored. I had more transfusions here and there, but everything was kept low-key. It wasn't better, but it wasn't worse. Then in 2016, I became very sick. I acquired 9 upper respiratory infections in the span of about 3 months. Something was very wrong. We were then told that my immune system had just up and died on me, and it was never going to regenerate again. I was now fighting common variable immunodeficiency, and I was to need and receive 5-hour IVIG treatments every 21 days for the rest of my life. That would give me a temporary immune system, and I needed it so that infection would not kill me. I also had fought pneumonia 9 times in just a year and a half. I remember telling God that I just couldn't do this for the rest of my life, and I wasn't strong enough. He needed to carry me. I now was fighting 3 rare diseases on top of each other. My body was now officially shutting down on me. For about 2 years, I went every 21 days and received this extremely painful treatment that kept me safe. My counts began to drop again. We knew that my aplastic anemia was a progressive disease and I would soon need life-saving measures. I was now down to needing platelet transfusions every single week. My body was bruised and petechiaed from head to toe. I couldn't even wear shoes without my feet bruising. Every morning I would wake up with blood inside of my mouth and all over my pillow from my gums spontaneously bleeding. My nose would bleed and I was just becoming more and more fragile. It was finally decided that we needed to go ahead with the bone marrow transplant. It was too dangerous to stay where I was at, and I was now at my last resort. After fighting for 11 years, now was the time to fight the biggest battle of my life. It was decided that I would need to receive actual marrow from my donor's bones. It had the least amount of risk, rejection, and so on. We just needed a perfect match. 3 out of 4 of my siblings were tested, and we knew that matching with a sibling was only a 25% chance. But results started coming back that my brother and younger sister did not match me. So we were now left waiting on the results for my older sister, Becca. We got word that I also had 4 other matches in the donor registry, and this was exciting and so encouraging. But of course we knew that the best case scenario would be to match with a full sibling. Just a few days later, my oldest sister, Becca, surprised me and broke the news to me that she was my perfect match. Not only was she a match, but she was a perfect 10 out of 10 match. They said that they could not have wanted anything better than that. We cried a lot that day. This was a humongous answer to prayer. My best friend, the person I looked up to in life and loved more than anything, was going to literally be the one to help cure me after 11 years. I went through dozens of tests to make sure that my organs, every organ of mine, would be strong enough to withstand the chemo and the transplant. My sister also went through lots of tests as well. She then signed her life away, as I also did mine. I was now scheduled to be admitted on September 1st, and the countdown began. It was July, just 2 months before my transplant, that I would almost lose the love of my life. At only 40 years old, my husband suffered a massive heart attack. And in fact, it was labeled the deadliest type of heart attack. I called 911 despite his assurance that he was okay and his life was saved. His right upper coronary artery was completely closed off. They said if I would have waited another minute to call, my husband would not be here today. While putting in the stent to open up his artery, the bottom of his heart was just starting to stop. We literally only had seconds. This was a nightmare and he wasn't supposed to live. We couldn't believe it. He was young, healthy, strong. 1 week later, to the day, my sweet husband, who had just survived the deadliest type of heart attack, was now suffering a second massive heart attack. His new stent that he had put in completely clotted off and closed again. I again watched him turn white and then gray. His body was freezing cold, and I was wiping what seemed like buckets of sweat off of his head. All I could do was lay my hand on him and just pray. I thought, surely this is how I lose the love of my life. How can he survive 2 of the deadliest type of heart attacks? But he did. God spared his life a second time, and I'll never stop thanking him. The week I was to be admitted for my transplant, I decided to take some of the power back. So on my couch, in my beautiful, peaceful home, each of my babies, my husband, and my sister held a pair of scissors. I took a deep breath, and they each began to cut off my braids. My best friend then shaved off what was left of my hair. I wanted to show my babies that mommy was okay, that I was strong, brave, no one hurt me, and we did it together. We did it, and we're okay. And I was now ready to fight. It was now time to say see you later to my sweet babies. Because of the risk, they were not old enough to visit me on my transplant floor. I remember holding them on my couch and just weeping. They didn't know that there was a risk that they would never see me alive again. They didn't know, but I did. I just held them, told them how much I loved them, and that me and Aunt Beba had to go fight now. I told them that mommy would be back, and with God's strength, I let them go out of my arms. It was the most excruciating pain I've ever felt. I just begged God to carry me again. I told him that I needed him to get me back home so I could help raise them. The next 5 days were full of receiving chemotherapy. It killed everything except my organs, and even those were affected. My body was literally brought down to zero. My old immune system, as I knew it, was completely gone. The chemo was emptying out my bone marrow in order to make room for my sister's cells to grow. And the huge day was finally here, transplant day. My sister went into the operating room early that morning. She was put to sleep and put on a breathing machine. They had her on her belly and began to remove as much of her bone marrow as possible from both of her hips. The harvesting surgery took about 2 hours. Her hips were syringed 190 times. They said her body would decide how much she would give, and she did not disappoint. She gave just about everything she had. She gave about 2 liters of her blood and bone marrow for me. She is my hero. The bags of her marrow were hung, and I received them like a typical blood transfusion. She gave so much that I was actually still being transfused into the next day, but everything went smoothly and perfectly. The days following my transplant were the absolute hardest physical and emotional days of my life. The chemo kicked in and my blood counts were destroyed. They literally bring you face to face with death and then slowly bring you back to life with your new cells. I was now beginning to suffer. I had no strength to even button up my clothes. I didn't even have the energy to Skype and talk with my babies. Some days I would just stare at them as they talked, and all I could do was to nod at them. Then I would have to put the phone down because it took every ounce of strength I had left. They wanted us to do 11 laps every day on the transplant floor, which equaled 1 mile. The earlier days I would do around 20 or so laps, but on my hardest I would barely do 1. I met incredible friends on that floor who were also suffering with babies of their own back home. We walked the halls with each other and kept encouraging each other to keep fighting. It was a huge reason that I got up every day and walked those halls. It was very, very important to keep moving. Little did I know, I would go from walking laps with an IV pole on my transplant floor to soon walking in miles for Moffett in downtown Tampa with my entire family just 93 days later. As we were planning for me to be discharged to my post-transplant housing, I started getting a sore throat. We chalked it up to the super dry, pressurized air in my hospital room. But then almost overnight, it escalated to hell. My throat, tongue, lips, inside of my cheeks, every square inch of my mouth had broken out in something called mucositis. I had the most excruciating open sores coating my entire mouth and tongue. I'm not talking little canker sores, I'm talking hell. Huge sores that were even black in color. They said it was the worst case they had ever seen, and in fact, they had doctors coming into my room taking pictures of my mouth in disbelief. My tongue was swollen to about 3 times the size of a normal tongue. My lips were swollen with open sores on them as well. And in fact, they had to biopsy and cut a chunk of the sore off of my lip to test it. I ended up having staph infection inside of my lips and then something called thrush, a fungal infection, on top of my mouth sores. At one point, they were even worried that I had mold growing inside of my mouth. It was so bad. I couldn't smile, talk, eat, swallow, nothing. I couldn't take it despite even being put on a strong pain pump that ran 24 hours a day. What was even more awful was that there was nothing they could do. We had to wait for my sister's cells to start growing in order to heal those sores. So I had to endure this for a few more weeks. I remember telling God that I just couldn't do it anymore. This felt like it was never, ever going to pass. I wanted out of this body, and if that meant taking me to heaven, so be it. My sister also later admitted to me that I had told her on 2 occasions that I felt it was my time to go, that I was ready to go to heaven and finally be healed, that I had finally met my match after 11 years. I was ready to be with Jesus now and be healed. My amazing husband, mom, and sister would stay many nights with me, excuse me, and just sit right next to my bed. They would hold my hand, rub my arms, help me shower, encourage and cheer for me when I would drink just sips of my protein shakes. They just plain spoiled me. They would try so hard to make me laugh and keep me going. The 32 days in the hospital and 30 plus days in the post-transplant housing would finally pass. During that time, I suffered so much pain, depression, doubt, wondering if God had forgotten about me. But I somehow never lost hope. I knew that if He had kept me alive for one more day, then I still had work to do. I questioned Him if this story of mine, full of pain, heartache, loss, failure, fear, was really worth telling. And each time He has whispered to me, yes. My pastor John reminded me in the hospital that it was not a surprise that the enemy attacked and silenced the one instrument that God has called me to use in telling my story, my mouth. And you know what He did? He silenced me for weeks physically, but here I am today, my mouth healed and my story being told. I'm no longer silenced. I look back on my life and stand in awe of what God has brought me through. These past 31 years, I have made it through bullying, suicidal threats, a broken home, domestic violence relationship, the threat of lymphoma, almost losing my husband to 2 heart attacks, almost losing my daughter, 10 bone marrow biopsies, hundreds and hundreds of blood draws, 2 lymph node biopsies, countless blood transfusions and shots, 50 rounds of IVIG infusions, countless hospital stays, a lip biopsy, skin biopsy, spinal tap, 3 rare diagnoses, and even a bone marrow transplant. I still suffer with post-traumatic stress regarding the transplant. I'm a little slower than what I once was, a little weaker, and I still have a long ways to go to recover. I am now a certified germaphobe, and I usually hibernate in my house to protect my 5-month-old baby immune system. When I look back at what God has brought me through, I see that His power and His strength was made perfect in my most weakest of moments. I see grace, I see hope, I see the days that I only had faith the size of a mustard seed. I ran out of my strength a long time ago. I am standing here today because of Him. I stand here today declaring that I am not a victim, I am a victor. Many times in my life, I've felt like my life was falling apart. But standing here today, I'm again reminded that it was actually falling into place. I'm not sure what struggle or adversity you have faced or are facing, not just in your physical pain, but also in your hurting relationships, finances, work, loss, anything and everything in between. But my hope in sharing my story today is to encourage at least one person to keep on going. Keep on going despite what you have against you. Persevere with His strength and keep the hope that no matter what, He will always see you through. I want to end with one of my favorite quotes, and it says, "I am not afraid. There is nothing to fear. I've been through the flames, and by God's grace, I'm still here."
Well, if you've been wondering what we talk about being Brooke Bold, that right there is what we've been talking about all day.
Give it another hand for Melissa Work. Amazing.